Welcome to MasterLearn. Here we'll cover a very important topic on this idea of stress. Found this article, it's back in 2013, but the title, Cortisol, Why the Stress Hormone is Public Enemy Number One. 5 simple ways to lower your cortisol levels without drugs. I thought this was worthwhile to explore together. If you are familiar with cortisol in itself, you do know that it is considered a stress hormone. Cortisol in itself is not, I don't want to use this term too lightly, it is not harmful. It has a function. But the problem is it becomes a stress hormone when it is overactivated. And as we know with the body, anything that is too much then becomes an imbalance, anything in excess. Public enemy number one, I like how they listed this because ultimately the stress hormone, it has become the public enemy. Why? Because stress has become chronic. And it has become chronic to the level where it is becoming a normalcy to exist in this state. But let's explore. I've not read this article, and as with all of these kinds of articles that I find and we explore together, I deliberately do not read them ahead of time. I'd like to be exposed to the novelty just as you. I like the picture here where this person seems to be covered in or blocked by something, right? Her hand is on something. So perhaps she's blocked maybe in a box or a circle, enclosed or trapped. Hand is on the head because symbolic, whether they knew it or not, the stress does not come from anywhere else in the body. It comes from the brain, but also from the mind. The brain is a channel. It is a vehicle for where what we are calling mind tends to reside in its main state or main space. And we can prove this because if you chop off your foot, even though your mind is also in your foot, you would still be alive. Chop off your hand, you'd likely survive that with enough care. Chop off your leg, you could still survive that. But chop off your head, and you quite likely will not be here anymore. So there's some semblance of dominance of mind. Also, too, we could say with the heart, you remove the heart to remove any of these organs, you may not be living for quite some time. But in terms of what we're discussing here, stress and the seat of consciousness, although consciousness exists throughout the body, throughout the cells and the DNA, the house, right? The main house, or the master bedroom, we would say, in the mind. This is why her hand is on her head and not on her heart. The palette here is a mesh or mixture, which I like because here it's symbolizing that it's complicated, right? It's nuanced. The palette or the mesh, if you splash these colors with brush strokes or paint strokes, it's not going to be the same for everybody. It's going to look different. So let's get to the article. The stress hormone cortisol is public health enemy number one. Starts off this way. Scientists have known for years that elevated cortisol levels interfere with learning and memory. This is extremely important. Interfere with learning and memory, lower immune function and bone density, increase weight gain, blood pressure, cholesterol, and heart disease. The list goes on. Right off the bat, the first section, it's telling us just how effective this hormone is on essentially destroying our existence. And so having this knowledge right at the start, I would think it would be exceptionally important for educators and society at large to get a handle on this, to not see this as a normalcy, because who wants learning and memory interference, a lowered immune system and decreased bone density, increased weight gain, heightened blood pressure? Who wants all of that to be a normalcy? The fact that we know chemically what is a source of this, we need to be finding out ways to master this thing. this should be, if it's public enemy number one, we need the public ally number one. And I'm curious to see if they begin to describe what some of those allies are here. The article continues, chronic stress and elevated cortisol levels also increase one's risk for depression, mental illness, and lower life expectancy. The list goes on. These three are chronic in our Western society anyway. Depression, mental illness, and lowered life expectancy. Chronic. So what it's also saying is that these are not roots, these are not sources, these are effects of a source, which here would be the chronic stress. Stress being a creator or manifester of these. It continues, this week, 2 separate studies were published in Science, linking elevated cortisol levels as a potential trigger for mental illness and decreased resilience, especially in adolescents. Super important. I did happen to listen to an audiobook. The name escapes me right now. I believe it's called Coddling of America. Did talk about in pretty great depth about the increase in the mental challenges with the adolescent community, and the age ranges are getting younger for these kinds of thought forms. Now, if we go into the metaphysics of this and we talk about energy patterns and vibrations and frequencies, these are actual thought forms, right? So a thought form is literally a form of thought. It is, if we look at the machinery that manage the brain waves, they are types of waves, types of frequency patterns. On a practical level, the book did talk about how social media has been a major contributor for this challenge here, these mental challenges, particularly in the realms of self-esteem and developing a healthy ego. By the way, it's important for us to have an ego. I'm not going to go off on that tangent, but consciousness community does have some challenges here, talking about you need to erase your ego. You can't have an ego. You need to get rid of your ego. But if you understand what the ego is, it's about identity. And in a society where you have nothing but forms around you, you need to be able to differentiate between the forms. You need to know what a smartphone is versus a cordless phone or a landline phone. That's identity. Those are 2 different types of forms. You need to know the difference between your hand and your foot. Those are 2 different forms. The moment that you give a name and you distinguish between the 2 things, you are giving form, or you are assigning a name or term to different forms that you recognize. That I am here sitting down, speaking and recording this, and that you are somewhere else and listening. We are 2 different forms. 2 different forms, therefore 2 different identities, 2 different egos. Without that differentiation, you just wouldn't be able to function in a society that is multifaceted and has multiple forms. So don't let anybody tell you that you need to erase your ego. You need to understand the ego and what its purpose is in this particular life pattern. That's the wisdom to be able to use the ego in its proper place. It has a place, as everything does. Tangent over. The next paragraph continues. Cortisol is released in response to fear or stress by the adrenal glands as part of the fight or flight mechanism. And so this is why cortisol is important. Remember, everything has its place. The true alchemist understands that everything in existence has its function. Whether we dislike it or not, it has a place. And what we need to do is understand the place and ensure that it is doing its function in its place. I will read this again. Cortisol is released in response to fear or stress by the adrenal glands as part of the fight or flight mechanism. The fight or flight mechanism is part of the general adaptation syndrome defined in 1936 by biochemist Hans Selye, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, of McGill University. He published his revolutionary findings in a simple 74-line article in Nature, in which he defined 2 types of stress, eustress and distress. The eustress would be the quote unquote good stress, and distress would be quote unquote bad stress. Perhaps, okay, give them credit for the names and coming up with this. But I will tell you, based off of much older knowledge in existence, that the mechanisms of the brain and the emotions and stress have long been understood under different names. The article continues. Both eustress and distress release cortisol as part of the general adaptation syndrome. It's interesting that they call it a syndrome instead of system. Syndrome almost makes it sound like it's a problem. Once the alarm to release cortisol has sounded, the article continues, your body becomes mobilized and ready for action. So here's the value, right? The alchemy. But there has to be a physical release of fight or flight, meaning we have to make use of the cortisol release in the body, excuse me. It builds up in the body. It makes us faster, stronger. It heightens our senses. It makes us ready to go, right? Ready to do something. But we have to actually use it. We have to do something with it. We have to take action. Otherwise, the article says, cortisol levels build up in the blood, which wreaks havoc on your mind and body. So if we're not doing anything with it, it goes to waste essentially and starts flooding the system. Eustress, it says, creates a seize the day heightened state of arousal, which is invigorating and often linked with a tangible goal. Cortisol levels return to normal upon completion of the task. This is all alchemy. Identifying the use of a capacity, of a resource, putting it to use, and then it goes away. Cortisol continues. The article continues. Cortisol levels return to normal upon completion of the task. Distress or free-floating anxiety doesn't provide an outlet for the cortisol and causes the fight or flight mechanism to backfire. Ironically, our own biology, which was designed to ensure our survival as hunters and gatherers, is sabotaging our bodies and minds in a sedentary digital age. What can we do to defuse this time bomb? Lot to unpack there. We will not too much, but I will say that this is likely to amplify given the kind of environment we are in now with an illness, health challenges out there, and more remote work styles, and just more encouragement to be at home and not do anything or go anywhere, right? To not use the body in many ways. That on top of already being digital bound and being on devices, things like this, a lot of sitting. So I anticipate this to amplify. Luckily, the article continues. You can make 5 simple lifestyle choices that will reduce stress and anxiety and lower your cortisol levels. Before we get into these 5, I will say that as well, the article makes cortisol appear as if it is the ruler, it is the decision maker. The cortisol is not the decision maker. As with everything in the body that has intelligence, it is guided by a higher intelligence. And so, as I mentioned in a previous video, when the scientists talk about the brain doing things, right? The brain does this or the brain does that. It is not essentially the brain. The brain is a house. Therefore, there is a consciousness. There is a force that activates the brain to do certain things. Just as there are forces that guide the liver to perform its function and guide the heart to beat, because we are not actually telling the heart to beat. There's a force operating. It's very practical and clear. We can self-examine that. So cortisol as well is not the doer in this. The cortisol is a medium for something that is immaterial, and that is the mind. What drives the mind to Feel stress is a sense of being out of control. Here they talk about fight or flight, but it is a sense of being out of control when, if we are in a situation that we experience and based on how we see ourselves incapable of handling an experience, this cortisol starts firing up and we get into this quote unquote distress or bad stress mode. It is a matter of perception then that a situation causes the stress or the cortisol levels to rise. We're just backtracking. All we're doing is going back and back and back and back and back to the root, to the immaterial, which is the eye or perception, a way of seeing something. Because if you take two people into a plane and they go skydiving, one person who sees this as an extremely fearful experience and they jump out of the plane, they're going to have a different stress response than someone who sees this as an adventure and as an enjoyment. There's really nothing different about the actual jumping out of the plane or being up high. It's the same for both people who are in the plane, but the difference is in the perception and the way that these two individuals think. So the thinking, we're backing, right? The mind and the thinking and the way of perception of a situation then stimulates the production of the cortisol. What does that mean? It means we then need to pay attention to the mind and the quality of the mind and the way that we use the mind and the way that we think, the quality of the thoughts. Let's continue. Number 1, regular physical activity. Kickboxing, sparring, or a punching bag are terrific ways to recreate the fight response by letting out aggression without hurting anyone, thus reducing cortisol. I can relate to this as a martial artist. It actually, what it does too is it creates a comfort being in that environment. So again, with the perception, it is not as dangerous physical activity, especially this rigorous martial kind. It's not as dangerous seeming when you're doing it enough times. You're actually comfortable in the environment, so it doesn't create stress in that way. Aerobic activities, it continues, like walking, jogging, swimming, biking, or riding the elliptical are great ways to recreate the flight outlet and burn up cortisol. A little bit of cardio goes a long way. Just 20 to 30 minutes of activity most days of the week pays huge dividends by lowering cortisol every day and in the long run. They're saying just get it out of your system. Fear increases cortisol. So again, back to what I was describing. Fear increases cortisol. Well, what is fear? Fear is a state. It's a mental state. There isn't a physical thing out there that says fear. It doesn't exist in physicality. Fear is a state that is induced or manifested based on how we see something, right? Or how we perceive, how we, again, just run the scenario. Do the thought experiment, 2 people in the plane, or do a thought experiment, 2 people in a caravel. Do another thought experiment, 2 people about to do a presentation. Another thought experiment, 2 people about to go to work, their very first day on the job. The differences in ways of perceiving and thinking will influence those 2 people differently. The one person who sees their first day as hellified because they feel unprepared will have this fear increased cortisol. The person who feels like the first day is going to be amazing and they are excited for challenges, they're not going to experience that. So fear also itself is quite subjective. It's in the mind. Fear increases cortisol. The article continues. Regular physical activity will decrease fear by increasing your self-confidence, resilience, and fortitude, which will reduce cortisol, right? Exactly what I was saying. Yoga will have a similar effect with the added benefit of mindfulness training. Again, they are now talking about the sources here, which I'm glad. If your schedule is too hectic to squeeze in a continuous session of aerobic activity, you can reap the same benefits by breaking daily activity into smaller doses. Okay, they're getting to some time management stuff. An easy way to guarantee regular activity is to build inadvertent activity into your daily routine. Riding a bike to work, walking to the store, taking the stairs instead of the escalator. These all add up to a cumulative tally of reduced cortisol at the end of the day. Pretty practical. Here they give another method, looks like mindfulness and loving kindness meditation. This is pretty interesting that they're going to mention what I'm seeing here as the vagus nerve. Any type of meditation will reduce anxiety and lower cortisol levels. We need to read that several times because there is a solution. Any type of meditation will reduce anxiety and lower cortisol levels. As I host in meditation for job-seeking alums, we talk about this, the vagus nerve, which comes up next, but the importance of having a meditation practice, no matter what your craft is or your field. It would be beneficial for everyone to have a meditation practice. It doesn't matter what type it is. And it doesn't matter what the art is, what your field of your vocation is. Having a meditation practice can sit at the foundation of all of that. Because you're reading here, it says it reduces anxiety and lowers your cortisol levels, amongst other benefits, host of life-affirming benefits to it. Let's continue. Simply taking a few deep breaths engages the vagus nerve, which triggers a signal within your nervous system to slow heart rate, lower blood pressure, and decrease cortisol. The next time you feel yourself in a stressful situation that activates your fight or flight response, take 10 deep breaths and feel your entire body relax and decompress. Why does it work? Because it's science. It's a scientific fact. If you have a body, you have a Homo sapiens body, it's going to work if you're diligent. Next, it says, setting aside 10 to 15 minutes to practice mindfulness or meditation will fortify a sense of calm throughout your nervous system, mind, and brain. Very true. There are many different types of meditation. Meditating, as in quotes, doesn't have to be a sacred, new agey, woo experience. That too, I agree with. People often ask me what kind of meditation I do and how to practice loving kindness meditation, the author says. The author says, I am not an expert, but have developed a technique that works for me. I suggest that you do more research, visit a meditation center if you can, and fine-tune a daily meditation practice that fits your schedule and personality. And then looks like the author is proceeding to go into detail on it. I will not go through the depths of this as this is a unique practice. You could always visit the article. Let's go to number 3, social connectivity. 2 studies published this week in Science illustrate that social aggression and isolation lead to increased levels of cortisol in mice, which trigger a cascade of potential mental health problems, especially in adolescence. What I can say about that is this goes back to, if you saw the video presentation on consideration and building rapport, that this is in total opposition to building rapport and consideration. So social aggression and isolation is a detachment of building social bonds and relationships. It also is an antithesis to the interdependence I've been describing, in that we are not totally independent of anything on this planet. And so to go in the opposite direction of total isolation, essentially for purposes of rebellion, actually harms the individual. Isolation in times of needing to focus and perhaps completing a project or to go through a period of self-discovery. These are all wonderful, life-affirming reasons for establishing isolation, but by no means is it meant to be a permanent state. And the social aggression, which means just butting heads all the time, constantly fighting people, creates this state of cortisol increase and stress. The article continues, researchers at Johns Hopkins established that elevated levels of cortisol in adolescents change the expression of numerous genes linked to mental illness in some people. Fascinating. Why does this not make more headline news? This was back in 2013. So now we're talking about epigenetic experiences, meaning either thoughts or chemical changes in the body, environmental influences affecting gene or genetic expression. They found that these changes in young adulthood, a critical time for brain development, could cause severe mental illness in those predisposed for it. These findings, reported in the January 2013 issue of Science, could have wide-reaching implications in both the prevention and treatment of schizophrenia, severe depression, and other mental illnesses. Now, this is psychology today is kind of it is a more of a mainstream type of website and magazine where they try to bring the science, cutting edge kind of science to the general population. It's not about presenting hard white papers and it's pure raw scientific studies. They're trying to make it grounded so people can use this information in practical living. So if Psychology Today publishes this, what do you think marketers understand about the psychology of the population? They understand that if you can create on a local level, an individual level, these kinds of manifestations, then you likely could create these kind of manifestations at the public level, right? Or the societal level through forms of media. Just food for thought. I won't go into that in this particular talk, but I am hinting. And I hope as we go through these kinds of videos, this is inspiring your polymath way of thinking. All to say, your multi-disciplinary or your multi-dimensional way of thinking, where that you see the connections to things. Marketers have access to this knowledge. Why wouldn't they have access to this kind of neuroscience and scientific knowledge? And if they do have access to it, why would they hold back, especially the more malicious kinds who want the profits? Why would they hold back trying to induce fears and cortisol elevations in populations to create quote unquote problems that need to then be solved? Food for thought. Next paragraph, Akira Sawa, a professor of psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and his team set out to simulate the social isolation associated with the difficult years of adolescence in human teens. They found that isolating mice known to have a genetic predisposition for mental illness during their adolescence triggered quote-unquote abnormal behaviors that continued even when they were returned to the group. Their genes were turned on, so the manifestations were there. They found that the effects of adolescent isolation lasted into the equivalent of mouse adulthood. Genes turned on. Open quote, we have discovered a mechanism for how environmental factors such as stress hormones can affect the brain's physiology and bring about mental illness, said Sawa. Let me quote that again. Open quote. We have discovered a mechanism for how environmental factors such as stress hormones can affect the brain's physiology and bring about mental illness, end quote, said Sawa. Make a connection to what I just described. If the knowledge is here, what makes you think that businesses or marketers or advertisers do not have this knowledge and have been actively deploying it in the population? Open quote again. We've shown in mice that stress in adolescence can affect the expression of a gene that codes for a key neurotransmitter related to mental function and psychiatric illness. While many genes are believed to be involved in the development of mental illness, my gut feeling is environmental factors are critically important to the process. I have never read this article before. It's very important that you are able to make the connections right here. This is 2013, 7 years ago. Where do you think the science is now? We could bold or underline that. My gut feeling is environmental factors are critically important to the process. This means external. So things that are around us, images, sounds, pictures, movies, films, magazines, social media, all of it are considered environmental factors for the human population. Next paragraph continues. To shed light on how and why some mice got better, Sawa and his team studied the link between cortisol and the release of dopamine. Sawa says the new study suggests that we need to think about better preventative care for teenagers who have mental illness in their families, including efforts to protect them from social stressors such as neglect. And neglect then in that realm begins to breed this social aggression, being avoided or being, forced in isolation or not being considered, right? Remember, consideration, not receiving consideration and empathy can cause a person to, feel angry and begin to self-isolate oneself. Meanwhile, the article continues, by understanding the cascade of events that occurs when cortisol levels are elevated, researchers may be able to develop new compounds to target tough-to-treat psychiatric disorders with fewer side effects. So this article, remember, take it with a grain of salt. They are thinking on the pharmaceutical level, the pharmaceutical paradigm or the drug paradigm. So their solutions to this kind of situation will inherently involve you taking some drugs. Rather than, even though they have also mentioned that practices like mindfulness and meditation can lower the cortisol levels without drugs, they will push the drug imperative. In another study published in Science, French researchers revealed that mice subjected to aggression by specific mice bred to be bullies released cortisol. Now, this is interesting, right? They just said bred to be bullies. So people, well, not people, but the mice in this regard are cultivated to manifest these certain qualities. Make the connections, folks. The exact cascade of neurobiological changes was complex, but also involved dopamine. The researchers found that if they blocked the cortisol receptors, the bullied mice became more resilient and no longer avoided their fellow creatures. Close-knit human bonds, whether it be family, friendship, or a romantic partner, are vital for your physical and mental health at any age. And this goes back to the video on consideration and etiquette and why it is a science. It is a science of life affirmation rather than just being nice for nicety's sake. It's not really the point. And that's not what any of the masters in the past have talked about. When they talk about virtue and cleanliness and connecting with people and having healthy bonds, it is not just to be, feel good and nice. It is because that kind of frequency, that kind of purity invites higher elevation of thought and a higher quality of personal living, personal existence. It's a type of spiritual hygiene. Recent studies have shown that the vagus nerve also responds to human connectivity and physical touch to relax your parasympathetic nervous system. I'm reminded of the importance of having a good massage, right? The tend and befriend response is the exact opposite to fight or flight. The tend and befriend response increases oxytocin and reduces cortisol. So remember, this is very interesting how it's connecting a lot to the video on consideration. I did mention the term husband or husbandry. And if you look at the old term husbandry, its original meaning means to take care of or to tend to or to care for or to nurture. And so one who accepts the term husband ought to be accepting the responsibility as well to tend to the wife, right, or the partner, tend to care for, to nurture, to ensure one is taken care of. In this case, to tend and befriend. Related terms. They say make an effort to spend real face-to-face time with loved ones whenever you can. But phone calls and even Facebook contact can reduce cortisol if they foster a feeling of genuine connectivity, the importance being the genuineness of it. And here they have number 4, laughter and levity. Having fun and laughing reduces cortisol levels. If you ever had a a gut-busting laugh. It is painful in the gut, but also enjoyable. It does release tension. Many studies, it says, have shown that the benefits of having a sense of humor, laughter, and levity. Now, sense of humor, I would encourage you to check out the connection between sense of humor and intelligence, or wit and intelligence. There is a correlation that the level of wit and sense of humor can illustrate a level of intelligence because it shows an ability to engage with the world that is non-threatening. And if you engage something and you see it as non-threatening, it's quite likely because you are intelligent enough to be able to handle the situation. And when you see the situation as totally serious and not able to see the enjoyment or the wit or the humor in it, it is because the intelligence is not able to handle it, right? Or overcome it or use it. Number 5, and lastly, music. Listening to music, it says, that you love and that fits your mood you're in, and that fits the mood you're in, has been shown to lower cortisol levels. The author says, I recently wrote here about the wide range of benefits. There's a hyperlink in there that you can click on to further explore that come from listening to music. We all know the power of music to improve mood and reduce stress. Add reducing your cortisol levels as another reason to keep the music playing as a soundtrack of health and happiness in your life. I would also advocate for binaural beats. You can find a number of creators who design binaural beats. They operate on the various brainwave frequencies, your alpha, your beta, your delta, your theta waves. I would also advocate for just checking out YouTube, and you can search up, piano, listen to piano. You can check out terms like study music or study with me music, and people have been really inventive about creating these long, hour, 4 or 5 hour long sessions where you could just have it playing in the background and do what you have to do. In conclusion, it says, President Obama's second inaugural speech brought up many calls to action that can be framed through the lens of cortisol as public health enemy number 1. I won't read the rest of this, as you can just, take your time with the conclusion. Ultimately, you want to make your own informed reasoning. You look at the facts, you read the perspective, listen to what I have said about perspectives and connections, what I have encouraged, and you form and weave it within your own experience, and you come to your conclusions. Make sure your conclusions are based or grounded in what we would call ma'at tem ma'at, which means truth is truth. Whether you like it or not, a fact is a fact, a truth is a truth. And as with etiquette and as with virtue and as with what we're reading here about the science of this hormone, we want to be in alignment with the truth so that we utilize it in life-affirming ways. I hope this was enjoyable. It was fun to go through. A lot of connections here. Any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Send me an email. You can check out my education platform, MasterLearn.shop, or visit my blog, crownofmind.com. Be well.